Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Stewards of the Beautiful Land webinar. We've got a fantastic topic on forest management and bat habitat. But before we get started, just a couple of points to refresh everyone for. You should be able to see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. So the way that you're going to interact with us is in the questions tab. And if you see my lips moving, but you don't hear anything, first and foremost, well, you can't hear me tell you to up the volume, but you can try that phone number. Call that phone number with that PIN code, and then that'll be the audio version that you can listen in on the telephone if you need to. Reminder that we have our treesforever.org Stewards landing page where you can find all things related to stewards, including the information on the webinars that we have every 2 weeks, as well as some of the upcoming field days we have in September here. Things are winding down out in the field. We've been hosting various field days June, July, and August, wrapping up in September here. Lots of great events, some planting events, so don't miss out on that. Just a reminder here for a couple of upcoming events. Save the date, pardon me, for these two webinars. September 18th is going to be water quality and vertebrates, and October 9th will be that roadside roundtable. Also want to point out our Facebook page. So check out our Stewards of the Beautiful Land Facebook group. Feel free to comment, post pictures. It's a beautiful time outside in our prairies and our roadsides. So if you're out and about traveling and see something that fancies your interest, take a picture, post it. We'd love to see it. Again, those upcoming webinars on water quality and vertebrates with Jackie Gausch on September 18th, and then a roadside roundtable on October 9th. We'll have Christine Nemec, some information, or pardon me, some representatives from the Story County Roadside Department and how they utilize their equipment to manage roadsides. So that's going to be a fun and entertaining discussion about roadsides in Iowa. Well, without further ado, pardon me, before we get to bat habitat, some field days. And there's one coming up here on Friday that's going to be a lot of fun. Monarch tagging and then a prairie planting at Big Hollow Rec area. That's going to be near Sperry, Iowa. And then next week, that's going to be in Story County, invasive species removal at the Christensen Forest Preserve. So be sure to stop out, bring a pair of gloves, appropriate attire, so that you can help us do some invasive species removal. Then September 21st, there's going to be a native seed planting for bird habitat in Black Hawk County. Be sure to check that out. And then a prairie seed harvest and tree planting at the Willow Lake Nature Center in Harrison County. So some opportunities all throughout the state to get out, meet other like-minded individuals, get your hands dirty in some cases. So join us for some of those upcoming field days. Again, one final time, ask questions in the question box. Take a break as you need. We've got a solid 50 minutes of presentation and questions here. So without further ado, let's get this transferred over to Adam and Karen.
So my name is Adam Janke, and I have a title of Wildlife Extension Specialist at Iowa State University, where I have broad responsibilities in wildlife wide. Among other things, we like to often talk about species of conservation concern and how everybody has a role to play in helping those species thrive here in Iowa. And right at the top of the list of species that we're concerned about when we think about conservation and land stewardship here in Iowa are bats, as we're getting ready to make the case. So really excited to join in your webinar series today and talk to you about this important topic. And I'm excited to be joined by Karen Kinkead, who's the Wildlife Diversity Program Coordinator from the IDNR. So Karen, take it from here.
Yep, like Adam said, I'm a Wildlife Diversity Program Coordinator for the state of Iowa, and that means that the people I work with at the Iowa DNR, the Wildlife Diversity Program staff, are responsible for the species that is not legal to shoot or trap or fish in the state, which leaves us with a little over 1,000 different species. I do want to make the point that I am by no means a bat expert, but we will try to answer your questions today, and we've compiled some slides that we think might be helpful and informative, especially if you're new to bats and bat conservation in Iowa. So while we're getting started, Adam, if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide for me. While we're getting started here, I just wanted to quickly mention something that we're not covering today, but you might be interested in knowing about. The Iowa DNR assists Iowa State University with a program to monitor bats in Iowa. And each spring, we make a call for volunteer helpers. Those volunteers do 2 activities on 4 different days, usually in the month of July. They will walk into pre-chosen locations and set up a bat detector. This is a small machine attached to a microphone in a tree, which records all bat sounds all night long for a week or so. And then the volunteer packs up the equipment on a second day. So that's 2 of the 4 days. And then on 2 evenings, in between those 2 daytime walks, the volunteer and their partner attach a microphone to the top of their car via a suction cup and drive a predetermined route very slowly, about 20 miles per hour. Iowa State University processes all of those recorded bat calls, and those data help us monitor our bat populations. The data are also sent to the U.S. Forest Service. They have a national bat monitoring program so that bats can be tracked at the national scale. If this is something you are interested in, please keep in touch with us, or you can Google Iowa DNR volunteer bat to find a link to which you can submit your name and contact information. And that way next spring, we'll let you know of any potential opportunities near you where you could help with this. But today, we are here to talk about bats and their habitat needs. We'll also cover some bat information, including threats, management needs, and how you can help. Next slide, please, Adam. Iowa has 9 species of bats that are known to breed here during the summer months. They include the Indiana bat, the little brown bat, the tricolored bat, the northern long-eared bat, the hoary bat, the silver-haired bat, the red bat, the evening bat, and the big brown bat. Most bat offspring learn to fly between 3 and 6 weeks after they are born, but they still rely on their mother throughout that first summer and fall of life. Whether they are here in Iowa or further south, bats will hibernate over the winter, and then when the insects begin to emerge in the spring, so will our bats. By May or June, bats are looking for nursery locations and beginning to have 1 baby, sometimes twins, and then our red and our hoary bats may have up to 4 offspring at a time in late June or July. By August, those young are starting to catch insects on their own for their own food. In September and October, they're starting to move closer to their overwintering habitats, and some of them are looking for mates. In October and early November, they're eating as much as they can, building up fat reserves, and by mid-November, they're entering the hibernation period for the winter months. As adults, these bats can be as small as 2.5 to 2.7 inches. This would be like a little brown bat or an Indiana bat, but they can be as large as 5 to almost 6 inches long. We typically think of our big brown bats as our largest bats, but actually the hoary bat is just a tiny bit bigger. It's less than 1/2 inch, but it can be just a little bit bigger than our big brown bats. It's just that we see the big brown bats more than the other species, and so we tend to think of them as being larger. Next slide, please, Adam. Oh, you went way too far. Go back up. 1 more. All of Iowa's bats are insectivores. They eat lots of insects like mosquitoes, moths, and beetles, just to name a few. Most bats eat at least half of their weight in insects each night, and pregnant or nursing females can eat 100% of their weight in insects each evening. There have been a few studies that have quantified the amount of agricultural pests that bats eat, one of which said a group of big brown bats can eat 33 million corn rootworms in a year, and another that estimated that bats overall eat enough insects that would otherwise cost our farmers somewhere between $1 billion and $3 billion to combat each year. Bats help us by eating these insects. But all of these bats depend on our forests and woodlands to make their homes. Some of these species have what we would call maternity colonies or nurseries, where a bunch of females and their offspring spend the summer together in one small area, while other species are more solitary when raising their offspring, but all of them depend on Iowa's trees to successfully raise their young. Next slide, please. We think that typically only 5 of these species hibernate here in Iowa. We don't have the best handle on exactly where all of the bats overwinter as they hibernate, though. A few bats may use human buildings. Usually these are big brown bats, but there could be other bats mixed in. If you have bats in a building where that isn't compatible, we can provide information to help you contact a licensed nuisance operator and a wildlife rehabilitator to assist in excluding or moving the bats. In nature, however, here in Iowa, we only know of a few cave systems and a few old mine shafts where our bat species can overwinter, although we suspect that some may overwinter in hillsides that they can access through limestone rock openings that are just simply too small for people to pass through. But we really don't have a good handle on all of that. Next slide, please. That leaves us with 4 species that we consider to be migrators, that they move through Missouri to slightly warmer locations to spend the winter. Again, I would say that we don't know enough about these migrations. This whole process is still rather mysterious. Thinking about hoary bats, for example, we know that females raise their young in Iowa, but we hardly ever catch males here during the summer months. So we think that these male bats stay further south throughout the year, and then the pregnant females come to Iowa and elsewhere to raise their young. But occasionally, a hoary bat female may be found overwintering here in Iowa. There's still just so much we need to learn about bats and their needs. Next slide, please. The Indiana bat has been federally listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as endangered since 1967. The northern long-eared bat was listed as threatened in 2015 and then reclassified as endangered in 2023. The tricolored bat has been proposed to be listed as endangered, and that listing will go into effect very soon. The little brown-eared bat, the little brown bat rather, is under review right now by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we expect a decision on that within the next few months. The hoary bat is also on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's work plan to be evaluated in the year 2027. I do want to reiterate that these status determinations are made by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, meaning if this species is listed as threatened or endangered, these bats are federally protected. At least 4 of these 5 species are in trouble due to a fungal disease, which Adam will discuss more in just a minute. Our role then is more supportive to their recovery. We need to provide the best locations for these bats to live and eat and grow so that the ones that can recover from this disease or the ones that might simply have some sort of innate immunity to the disease can thrive and have more offspring to repopulate the species. Next slide.
So I'm going to start talking now about the challenges that we face with bat conservation. And Karen just set the stage for what we're talking about when we talk about bats in Iowa. And she also started to hint at some of the challenges that we face with bat conservation here in the state. For example, I might just share that when I graduated from college in the year 2009, only one of those species would have been listed on the Federally Endangered Species Act. That's the Indiana bat that has a really small geographic range, and we knew that it was kind of threatened because of that small range, and a small change in its wintering areas could have big impacts on that small population. Today, as you see, that roster of species that are either currently listed as threatened and endangered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or being considered as growing, and it's growing because of sort of the intersection of 3 pervasive challenges that bats and other organisms in Iowa's landscape are facing. The first of these challenges is just collision with infrastructure and specifically with wind turbines. The research on this has shown that it's especially high mortality source among those migratory species of bats that Karen introduced, and it's listed as one of the reasons that hoary bat is being considered for listing on the Endangered Species Act. The next threat that is facing bats, and I will talk about this one in more detail, is the exotic fungal disease called white nose syndrome. And white nose syndrome, as we'll discuss, affects the hibernating species of bats. And you see here I've added, if you really can pay attention and pick out those bats, I've added evening bat onto this list because they hibernate further south and are threatened by white nose syndrome out of Iowa. But we'll talk more about how that fungal disease has led to widespread population declines. And then finally, and of course, unsurprisingly, bats face challenges, just the degradation of their habitat and the loss of their habitat, places to forage, places to roost, and places to raise young. And that, of course, is a factor that affects all species. And fortunately, it's this last factor that we have the most control over, whether or not you are an active member in your community and helping manage, for example, public spaces in your in local parks or other natural areas, or if you're a landowner in managing forest or trees on urban or rural acreages. Everyone can have a potential positive impact on bats by considering bat habitat and trying to set the stage for these species recoveries amid these other larger factors that are a little bit more out of the individual's control. So that's what we're going to explore in more detail now as we start to think about how to create the bat habitat of the future that might help all 9 species of bats found in Iowa continue to thrive here. First, I want to talk more about this fungal disease that we've been alluding to called white nose syndrome. This is a picture of a bat infected with the fungus. And what you can see is that white material that gives the disease its name is growing on any exposed flesh. So basically the nose, the ears, and the wings start to grow a fungal pathogen that grows at just a very narrow temperature range that also happens to be the temperature range at which hibernating bats like to spend their winters. The thought is that this fungal disease prompts an immune response by the animal. So the animal essentially, its body detects this fungus as an infection and starts to fight it, which of course, anytime your body starts to fight an infection, your temperature goes up and you start to consume energy. And of course, we humans can't relate to what it's like to hibernate, but you could imagine going into hibernation and trying to sustain basic metabolic function for a long period of time is something where there's not a lot of wiggle room for extra metabolism to be going on. And so the thought is that this infection triggers an immune response, and then that triggers an arousal up out of hibernation. And so the bat literally wakes up in the cave, and the bat's instinct is to go find food. And so therefore, there's an additional energy expenditure, and the bat would fly around. And of course, it's the dead of winter, and Karen already said that all of these bats are insectivores, and so the bat can't find food. It expends more energy, doesn't bring any energy in, and we see widespread mortality associated with this disease. Now, this disease is a new challenge, which is important to understand. It was first detected in 2006 in a cave in New York where wildlife biologists found dead bats at the entrance to a hibernation spot, a cave, that had this characteristic white fungus on their face. Since then, this fungus that causes white nose syndrome has spread all across North America. What you can see in this figure is the first detection of the fungus by counties in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And what's depicted here are cooler colors were detected more close to that first detection in 2006. Warmer colors are more recent. The big areas where we don't detect or show evidence of white nose syndrome does not necessarily tell us that white nose syndrome is not there. Instead, it just reflects sort of sampling effort. It's hard to find where bats spend their winter, and thus it's hard to, which Karen already mentioned, and thus it's hard to know where white nose syndrome may be. We basically assume that every hibernating bat in Iowa throughout the entire state has been exposed to and is threatened by white nose syndrome. And that's certainly reflected by monitoring data in Iowa and to an even greater extent in neighboring states. Some of the data from neighboring states has actually quantified, because they had long-term population monitoring, has quantified the impact of the arrival of white nose syndrome. And this study is a little bit dated now, but back in 2017, researchers at the Indiana State University, after some long-term monitoring on caves in southern Indiana, documented an 80% decline in hibernating bat species following the introduction of the fungal pathogen that causes white nose syndrome. So that means that the skies around these caves went from looking like the last slide, to this 80% decline to this picture. So it's literally erasing bats from our skies and posing a real challenge for their populations. So what can we do about it? Well, our message today, and the message of wildlife biologists across the United States, is that the best way to combat the impacts of white nose syndrome is to fight back with healthy bat habitat. So what we're going to do today for the rest of our time together is I'm going to describe and try to help you picture what healthy bat habitat looks like. And then Karen's going to wrap it up by telling you how you can get help, both financial and technical, from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and their partners in our pursuit of improving forest health in Iowa to help bats survive here. So to understand bat habitat, Karen already told us that they're all forest dwelling and all dependent on trees. And so we're going to talk about this in sort of two different ways. First, we're just going to look at the tree, and I'm going to tell you how bats use individual trees. What we learn there is going to apply from everything in our backyards in a city to a single tree in the middle of a big forested lot, say along one of Iowa's river systems. Then we're going to talk about how bats use the forest ecosystem, including areas around forests like water and field edges, to understand what a sort of bat needs from the entire landscape. First, this business of bats and trees, we can look throughout the tree to understand how bats take advantage of it. And first, we'll start sort of at the tip of the tree in the foliage. Not all species of bats take advantage of the foliage, but actually red bats are sort of foliage experts or specialists. And so what's depicted in this picture is a picture of a red bat way out on the tip of a branch, where they'll often be seen during the day, perched at the tip of these branches underneath some leaves. They're also will occasionally be flushed out of piles of leaves on the forest floor. So red bats, more than any other bat, are really inclined to use the outer edges of the trees. The rest of the bats, we tend to move inward more towards the trunk of the tree, and especially you'll hear talk of protecting bats by protecting trees species that have a tendency to have loose, shaggy bark. And so I have pictured here a picture looking up at a shagbark hickory, which is one of Iowa's native hickories. And bats will really take advantage of the loose, shaggy structure provided by these trees, and they'll literally tuck up underneath that loose bark during the day before they feed again at night. And some species will even raise their young in these caverns in loose bark. The species of trees that we have in mind that are native to Iowa that might provide that loose, shaggy structure include shagbark hickory, shellbark hickory, white oak, especially mature white oak trees, silver maple, and Kentucky coffee tree. All have that loose bark, and it's one of the species of trees we'll talk about protecting and promoting. The other thing that bats will take advantage of in the tree itself are cavities and crevices. The picture here on the left is an example of two different types of cavities, or two different cavities, both created by woodpeckers in this case. Cavities are also created naturally by just breaking off a branch and then the natural decay of where that branch was once attached. And different species of bats, especially little brown bats, will take advantage of cavities. They'll use those to spend their days, and they'll also use them to raise their young and nurse their young. And then finally, dead and hollow trees can be really important for bats. Karen mentioned the big brown bat's tendency to live in attics. In fact, it's so closely tied to human dwellings that the scientific name of big brown bat is actually like bat houseflyer. It literally was named for its affinity for human spaces. But obviously structures like that haven't always been around. And so what we actually think is that big brown bats shifted to attics once they became available. And the thought is that before they were available, they were probably using hollowed out large trees and logs that would be created, for example, like by this large dead tree on the edge of a field, a picture I took in Boone County. And so that's another area where big brown bats and other species of bats will take advantage of hollowed out areas in trees to raise their young and to spend their days. So we've talked about how sort of a bat uses an individual tree, whether that tree is alive or dead, the various ways that a bat uses an individual tree. Now I want to talk about how bats use the forest, how they use the sort of environment created around a collection of trees, of course. And the first thing to understand when we talk about what makes good bat habitat in a forest is we have to remember how bats feed. And of course, I'm sure you all know this and remember learning this in grade school, but just as a reminder, bats feed by echolocation. And so they're emitting a signal and then receiving that signal back when it bounces off of anything that it encounters. They're receiving it back to their ears and then using that as a way to hone in on insects like a moth or flies or other aerial insects. And so they're feeding exclusively in the air and they're feeding with echolocation. And so what we need to understand about bat foraging behavior then is the things that would interfere with effective echolocation and things that would also constrain the production of their food or insects. So first, to understand the things that interfere with echolocation is a scientist will use a term called clutter. And so this is a picture that I took with my camera just looking straight up into a forest canopy that would have a lot of what scientists call clutter. So that's basically a whole bunch of leaves and a whole bunch of branches and a whole bunch of plant material that would interfere with that echolocation behavior that bats use to find their prey. And so bats would struggle to forage in this forest because there wouldn't be a lot of places where they could fly and just receive returns in their echolocation back from their insect prey. Research in Ohio, research in Indiana, and research in a bunch of other places has shown that bat activity is greatest in areas where there's less clutter or less vegetation in the mid-story and understory of the forest. So basically, the more open structure surrounding trees that bats can find, the more likely they are to be foraging in those places. And we'll talk more about what recommendations result from that behavior of bats in a second. The next thing is, unsurprisingly, the area with the least clutter at all would be like, for example, over a crop field. And Karen already mentioned that bats feed extensively on the edges of forest over crop fields. And so forest edges are really important for bats and maybe especially important for certain species of bats. And so we often think of bat habitat extending well beyond where the trees stop and extending into adjacent forest, grassland, and wetland environments. And on the subject of water, bats actually primarily drink water by swooping down over open water sources. So they need open water sources like a pond or a stream or a river to get through their evenings or to survive. And then, of course, also lots of insects are produced in aquatic environments like streams and wetlands. And researchers have found that bats tend to be more active over water sources as well. And so what's depicted with this picture is an open water area immediately adjacent to a forest, which would be a critical element to protect for bat foraging habitat. So if we take all of that information that we just learned about how bats use individual trees and how bats use collections of trees and forested ecosystems in adjoining ecosystems, we can come up with the portfolio of recommendations for how to do right by bats in anywhere that we are managing. And so here's my 3 rules for doing right by bats to create better bat habitat. The first of these is to manage invasive species. The second is to promote open canopy structure. And the third is to protect bats and bat trees. We'll talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail now. So first is to manage invasive species. Why do we want to manage invasive species? Well, first, the invasive species that we face in Iowa forests primarily live in those two places that I said are most important for bat foraging, the 0 to 10 and 10 to 20 feet of the understory. If you're familiar with invasive species challenges in forests, you're going to be familiar with names like bush honeysuckle, European buckthorn, multiflora rose, and garlic mustard. All of those species exist sort of in the understory and midstory where bat habitat, bat foraging is can be really constrained by their density. The other things that invasive species do is they inhibit the regeneration of healthy canopy trees like oak forests. And they also, just because they become so dominant in a forest ecosystem, like this picture here from Henry County, they become so dominant in the forest ecosystem, they reduce the production of potential insect prey because there's just fewer potential host plants in the forest left for those insects to thrive on, and thus have less forage available for bats flying overhead. So collectively, the way to do right by bats in the forest, one way to do right by bats in the forest is to try to control invasive species like the bush honeysuckle shown. That's basically the only thing green that you see in this picture here. The next way to help bats in a forested ecosystem is to promote open canopy structure. This open canopy structure allows for more sunlight to hit the forest floor, and it facilitates the regeneration of oak and hickory forests that would be most attractive to a diversity of insects that would be good for food production for bats. It also allows for these open spaces, and so this picture that I'm showing here is from, I think this was in Des Moines, or I know this was in Des Moines County in southeastern Iowa, where they had been doing some active forest management and then also controlling invasive species and using prescribed fire. And they created this very open canopy structure you can see overhead that creates great places for bats to forage. And as was going on in Des Moines County in this case, thinning and other silvicultural, that's a technical term that you'll hear from foresters when you visit with them, practices in the forest that create diversity in the forest canopy and promote open structure can be really good for bats. And then finally, back to that first principle of how bats use trees in the forest is to protect bat trees. So I told you what they were. They're the snags, the trees with cavities, the dead trees, those loose bark trees like shell and shagbark hickory, white oak, silver maple, and Kentucky coffee tree. And then finally, protect the bats themselves by working in the forest during the winter when they're either deep below the ground in caves or abandoned mine shafts, or they're off to the southern United States, those migratory bats that Karen talked about, spending their winter down there. Winter's the best time to work in the forest and minimize potential impacts to bats. So with that, we're going to transition now back to Karen so that we can talk about all of the practices that you could take and how the Iowa Department of Natural Resources could help you in taking those practices to create more bat habitat.
So how can you help to ensure these species remain part of Iowa's landscape and natural heritage? Simply by keeping your forests and woodlands as healthy as possible. That's the primary thing we can do to help bats here in Iowa. You've heard Adam talk about the specific needs. It may be that one property does not have everything, but when you look across to your neighbors, the larger area likely does. And these bats do not know when they've left your property and moved onto your neighbor's land each night. From research here in Iowa, we know that bats have to have mature trees to live, but they also need those open areas and water sources Adam talked about. In fact, a landscape that has some closed canopy forest combined with those open understories, even paths or roadways, some crop fields, some waterways, that appears to be the perfect habitat for bats. So some things to think about include making sure that Iowa maintains a healthy oak hickory forest system, replanting bottomlands that may have been damaged in floods or other weather events, ensuring a good mixture of tree species in your woods so that you can buffer against losses of trees from new or novel tree impacts like emerald ash borer, for example. And then planting trees in urban areas is also important, especially those shagbark hickories. Not only do they provide shade for us, but they can provide homes for the bats as well. Next slide, please, Adam. So who can help you? Who can help you get started with this? Well, the DNR has district foresters scattered across the state, and you can see from the map on this slide how they stretch their duties. They cross several counties each. Some of our foresters have additional staff working under their direction that can help out as well. They can come out and walk your property with you to evaluate or give you some ideas of things that can be done to help improve the habitat. These consultations are free, but there's often a waiting list because they are free. And there are private consultants that may be able to get to you faster, but they might also charge you for that service. DNR foresters can create management plans for your property. They can tell you about cost sharing programs that you may be eligible for and what those requirements would be. For example, how many years your forest must stay intact if those funds are used, or how much money or work you might be required to contribute in order to be eligible for that particular funding. They can help you find a local contractor to do the work if you need trees removed or honeysuckle treated or other trees planted. But they also hold these local field days where you would be invited to come out to someone else's property and see the work that has been done on their land and the benefits that they've gotten from it. So if you haven't worked with our staff yet, this is a great way to continue learning about what you have on your land and how to keep those areas healthy. Next slide, please, Adam. I want to mention just a few of those cost share programs. There are others out there. The three I'm going to talk about are perhaps the most common, but like I said, there's lots of other opportunities out there as well. The first is the Resource Enhancement and Protection Program, or REAP. This is a state of Iowa program. It will pay up to 75% of the funding needed for a project up to a certain amount of money. It can only be used once every 10 years on the same acre of land. This program isn't really competitive. It's the first people that apply each year who usually get the funding. And we would consider this to be a great, easy program to get started with if you're just learning about these cost share opportunities. Next slide, please, Adam. Then there are a couple of federally funded programs that our staff can assist you with, such as EQIP, or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. This is a federal program through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. It pays a flat rate incentive payment for the management practices being used. It can be used multiple times on the same acres as long as you're doing different practices on that acre. But all the applications are ranked statewide, so there's no guarantee you'll get in. Competition usually depends on the amount of funding that Congress allocates for that year. And this is similar to REAP funding in that it's a fairly simple, great program to work with. That brings us to the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP. Oops, go back one more. Sorry, you got it. This one is, again, a flat rate incentive payment for the conservation practice or management you want to do. But you can also get an annual payment just for being in the program. It can be used multiple times on the same acres as long as you're doing different enhancements. However, after you've been enrolled in this program twice, it might be difficult to get back into the program, at least for a little while. Again, all the applications are ranked statewide, so there's no guarantees. This can be a more complicated program to apply for, but our staff can help you with that. And you may find that those payments outweighs that complexity. While this can be a great program to work with, you might be advised to first try one of the other programs just to learn how the process works and make sure that you're comfortable being enrolled in one of these programs for your property before you commit to this one. Next slide, please, Adam. So how do you find us? You can either search for Iowa DNR Forestry or Iowa DNR District Forester on the web to get to that map and contact information I showed earlier, or our partners at Iowa State University also maintain a database of opportunities by county, and you can use the QR code on your screen to access that web page. On the ISU site, you just search for your county and then you find information not only from the DNR side of things, but also about local contractors and other information that might be helpful. My hope is if you take only one thing away from our presentation today, But that would be that your forests and your lands are so important to the preservation of these wonderful wildlife species in Iowa. There are so many people willing to assist you by helping you learn what may be on your property, how your property is special, and what more could be done to keep your forest healthy. So that's what I hope you take away from this today. With that, I think Adam and I would be happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for a great, great topic. And let's get right into some questions here. And one of the first ones is, will this video or the slides be posted anywhere for future reference? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. This presentation is being recorded and it'll be made available on our Trees Forever YouTube page, so you'll be able to reference back to it most certainly. And I just want to chime in that, Adam, I found that fascinating, the use of bats by the structure of the tree. And when you showed the picture of the red bat, I just about jumped out of my seat, because I grow hazelnuts up here in northern Kossuth County. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I was walking down one of the rows early one morning, and I looked up and I saw a bat underneath some leaves, and I couldn't believe it. And so I grabbed my camera and I got some really nice footage. And so that must have been one of those red bats. And that was wonderful. And holy moly, here come the questions. So first one right off the bat, how effective are bat houses attached to trees and buildings, and what function are they playing?
Great question. Karen, I'll maybe start on this and then welcome your input as well. In general, we find that bat houses get used less frequently than you would like a birdhouse. You know, if you put a birdhouse up, you're almost, follow a few simple rules, you're almost certain to see a bird use it. Whereas bat house use is much less assured. In fact, I've seen research that puts bat house use probability at like a third, like put up 3 bat houses and maybe one of them gets used. There is some really nice guidance, especially out of the University of Illinois, about like sort of best practices to try to promote bat house use. Some of those recommendations are things like consideration of the site, like relative to other roosting sites, and also relative to like the foraging habitat and other needs that we've established that bats need. And then also things like putting them on posts instead of on trees or structures, and then also putting them as high as you can get them. Those are kind of the recommendations that come to mind, but I would definitely encourage you to look up that University of Illinois website and learn more about how effective, how to use bat houses effectively to help bats.
Karen, anything to add or good to go?
No, I think Adam covered that.
Fantastic. Here's a question. Can you speak to motus, M-O-T-U-S?
I can take that one. Yes, the motus system, Iowa recently joined that a few years ago. These are a series of basically radio antenna that are scattered across the state, and we're putting more up each year. And they record detections when an animal with a certain transmitter, radio transmitter attached to it, fly by that antenna. That gets recorded. And we just received funding from the Fish and Wildlife Service to do some bird and bat work along the Missouri River on the western side of Iowa, where we're putting up additional towers, and then Iowa State University is going to be putting some of these motus tags on birds. But one of the universities in Nebraska will be putting motus tags on bats. And those researchers will be working on both sides of the river. So we're hoping to start answering some of these questions about bat migration in particular. It's very exciting. And it's just one of the reasons we don't know as much about migration about bats is because they fly, and they fly so fast that when you put a radio transmitter on them, often they can outfly you, and we just can't track them as they're moving south. So we're hoping that with the motus system, we'll be able to learn a little bit more about that.
Oh, great information. I loved your citizen science too, how folks can get involved and
Mhm.
put a suction cup on top of their car and just cruise real slow. That's great. Hey, question here. How can people help bats if they find them injured or sick in their area? Any thoughts there?
Yeah,
Um, uh, Karen, you guys license them. Do you want to take that?
sure. On the DNR webpage, you can search for wildlife rehabilitator, and you will get a list of people by county who have the appropriate licenses to work with wildlife. Not everyone on that list is going to be willing to work with bats, but some are, and they do have a really good network where they stay in touch with each other. One of the biggest bat rehabilitators lives here in um, lives in Ames in the middle of the state, but they have series of volunteers across the state who can help get an injured bat from you and get it to an appropriate facility to be cared for and then released if it recovers.
And I might just add just one more thing. I just brought this slide back up. We shared this slide, this contacts feature with you because you can find forestry professionals that serve your county. We also, on this same website, the same feature, you can find licensed wildlife rehabilitators as well by county. And so that's the same list that Karen mentioned. We actually just, at Iowa State, just do a mailing to the DNR's list to try to provide another way to try to find those licensed wildlife rehabilitators. But everything Karen said still applies to the website. Not everybody takes bats, et cetera. But I just wanted to add as just one additional opportunity. And just to echo what Karen said, it is increasingly important as we're concerned about these bats to think about, especially in resolving conflicts in our structures, to work with licensed wildlife rehabilitators to try to reintroduce those bats into the wild.
Great resource. Thank you for sharing, both of you. Are there any fruit bats in Iowa?
I'll take that one. Good question. Globally, we find bats eating all sorts of interesting things. We find, bats being insectivores, bats eating fruits, bats drinking nectar from flowers, and then, of course, most infamously, bats sucking blood. We only have insectivorous bats in Iowa, which means no fruit bats, no nectar eating bats, and importantly, no blood sucking bats. And so, yes, great question. You will definitely see things about fruit eating bats. You'll see things about bats being pollinators and all that. But here in Iowa, they're all insectivores, which is pretty interesting. And it's why you hear us kind of really harping on that message about like, do what's good for insects, and what's good for insects is going to be good for bats.
Okay, a couple of questions about habitat and hickories. So, any data on minimum size of oak hickory forests to provide enough habitat for bats?
I would just as a starting point, no, because what we see among 9 different species of bats, a lot of sort of variation in their sensitivity to patch size. Classically, in wildlife, like some organisms only want like giant expanses. The classic example of Iowa and forest organisms is like pileated woodpeckers, like will not touch a forest unless it's like thousands of acres, running along a river. You're not going to see them in a small patch. But bats, across the 9 species of bats that we have in Iowa, we see some that would take advantage of a really small patch, like the example you shared, Jeff, about the red bat in the hazel tree in shrub in north central Iowa. Like they'll take advantage of trees in many different forms. Karen, remind me, I'm rusty. Don't we think there is a species that's more area sensitive than others in bats? Is it long ears that are area sensitive?
That's a great question.
Okay, you might have found the bounds of Karen and my collective.
We did say we weren't bat biologists per se.
Yeah, so great question. The basic answer is every tree in Iowa matters for a bat, full stop. Because among those 9 species of bats, some of them we know definitely don't demonstrate area sensitivity. Big brown bats and red bats being for sure an example of that. There may be some species that have more specialized adaptations that are seeking larger patches of forest. But yeah, you ran into the limitations of a bird biologist and a herpetologist here on leading the webinar.
Sure. Next question. It's hard to find hickory trees in landscape size, like maybe 2-inch caliper. Are nurseries going to start growing more hickory trees? And I'll maybe jump in there because I'm a member of the Iowa Nut Growers Association. And one of the things that Rhonda says is spot on. Hickories are notorious because they have a tap root, and that tap root is difficult to transplant and get, potted trees growing and stuff like that. So one of the strategies around that is actually grafting hickories onto pecan rootstocks that have a more fibrous root system. And so that has been one method that's been utilized to get some hickory trees started and growing. And so that is a possibility. But you're right, it's not very common to be able to find hickory trees in nurseries. Adam, Karen, any thoughts on this particular topic or anything to add?
The only additional thing I would add, Jeff, is that the State Forest Nursery does sell hickory trees, and quantities of that are kind of large. You have to buy them 25 at a time. But what I say of that is if you only want 5 of them, they're still really cheap, and you can give the other 20 to your neighbors. And we would love to see that. And yes, that's not the same thing as planting a nice bald and burlap tree that's already well on its way. But it might just be an option to be going down the right course. We're reminded of the rule that the best time to have planted a tree was 30 years ago. The next best time is today. And the State Forest Nursery is taking orders right now for trees and hickories, white oaks, and silver. They might not sell silver maple, but some of these trees on our list, are definitely available from the State Forest Nursery, a great resource that we have here in Iowa.
And one final thought, if you're ever up there in Bradford, Iowa, in this town of Bradford, they've got a whole bunch of hickory trees in yards and right-of-ways, and that's because some of the folks there took the time to just go and pluck out seedlings that were growing on private property, so they weren't taking anything from state property. But you can successfully transplant them, but you typically do have to get them a little bit smaller. Iowa State Forest Nursery is a great resource, and orders are now open, so go check out that website. So are the resources mentioned available today here and in the presentations available to nonprofits such as nature centers in addition to individuals?
So those 3 cost share programs that I mentioned, I don't believe are open to nonprofits, but there are other cost share programs that are open to nonprofits and county conservation boards and nature centers. So you really do need to reach out to your local person in your county to find out, because they vary by county. They can vary by geography in the state. I mentioned that we just got some federal funding to work along the Missouri River. We also just got some federal funding to do some habitat work in southeastern Iowa, but those are very time-limited programs, and they just sort of pop up in and out. They wink in and out over the state as these funding opportunities become available. Building that relationship, that local relationship with your local forester is really important, so that even if you can get a plan now but you can't find the funding for it, you never know when one of those opportunities are going to pop up, or you never know when your forester is going to be like, hey, I suddenly have 10 people in this small geography. It would be great to go after a federal grant just for this one area and get this work done. So those relationships are really important.
Excellent. And just a heads up here, thank you, Glenn, for sharing. Gilchrist Foundation mini grants are a good source for nonprofits to potentially tap into. So that's Gilchrist Foundation mini grants. Thanks again, Glenn, for sending that along. Fantastic. Any last questions before we wrap things up for today? Please get them in now or forever hold your peace. And I want to thank both of you. This has been a really interesting topic and something that I don't think a lot of folks are exposed to. And so that's just wonderful. Any other questions? None are coming in. So we're going to wrap this up. Look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for not the roadside roundtable, but the water quality and invertebrates with Jackie Gouch. Please check out the Trees Forever event webpage and please register for that webinar. It's going to be a fascinating discussion and topic. And with that, everyone have a great day, have a great week, and thanks, Adam, and thank you, Karen. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.